The rifle was already cold by the time anyone thought to look for her. That was the detail no one could explain afterward. Not the commanding officer who filed the report, not the forensic team that swept the ridge, and certainly not the 3 men from the Joint Task Force who spent 4 days interviewing everyone at CFB Petawawa who had ever spoken to Specialist Vera Quinlan. The rifle was cold, which meant she had been lying there, motionless, for somewhere between 6 and 8 hours before the shot. In February, on a ridge in northern Ontario, where the wind chill drops things to the kind of temperatures that make metal contract and scope calibrations drift. She had accounted for all of it. That was the part that kept the investigators awake. It started as most things that end badly in the military start, with a decision made by someone who was not going to be there when it went wrong. The operation had a clean name. Internally, it was called CASPAR, and on paper, it was straightforward. A high-value surveillance asset had been compromised in a region 300 kilometers northeast of Thames, where a series of mining access roads fed into Crown land that had been quietly flagged by CSIS 18 months prior. The asset was a person. The asset had a family. The family had been moved once already, and the move had not held. What CASPAR required, according to its operational brief, was a 2-person forward observation team with long-range overwatch capability positioned on the north ridge of a terrain feature called Marker 7 to cover the extraction window. What CASPAR got was Vera Quinlan, alone. The second member of the team, a corporal named Thiessen, had been pulled 48 hours before insertion for a reason that was never formally documented beyond the words operational reassignment, which in the Canadian Armed Forces means roughly as much as the wind. Quinlan had flagged the change through her chain of command. She had submitted the request in writing. She always submitted things in writing, which was one of the reasons certain people found her difficult. And the response she received was a phone call from a captain, whose name she had never heard before, who told her that CASPAR's timeline could not be adjusted and that her individual skill set was assessed as sufficient for solo execution. She had written that down too. Vera Quinlan was 31 years old at the time of the CASPAR operation. She had grown up in Sudbury, the daughter of a woman who taught mathematics at Laurentian University and a father who worked underground at the Creighton mine until his lungs decided otherwise. She had inherited her mother's precision and her father's patience, the kind of patience that comes from watching someone spend 20 years in the dark, measuring things in increments, never mistaking movement for progress. She had joined the forces at 19, scored in the 97th percentile on spatial reasoning assessments, and had been quietly redirected into a marksmanship stream that her recruiting officer described as specialized, and which she understood to mean that she would be asked to do things that did not appear on any organizational chart. She was good at it. Not just good, the kind of good that makes other good people slightly uncomfortable, the way a musician who can play a piece from memory makes the ones who need the sheet music feel something they will not name out loud. She did not talk about her scores. She did not post photographs from ranges. When other members of her unit gathered in the mess to talk about equipment or technique, she listened more than she spoke, which some of them mistook for shyness and others mistook for arrogance. Neither was correct. She was simply someone who understood that the gap between knowing something and being able to use it is exactly as wide as the attention you give it. She gave it all of her attention. Her commanding officer at the time of CASPAR was a lieutenant colonel named Adair Spenlow, a man who had the posture of someone who had once been told he had potential and had been living off that information for 15 years. Spenlow did not dislike Quinlan. He was more precise than that. He found her inconvenient. She had a habit of being right in ways that made other people's decisions look like what they were. And in a unit where institutional memory was maintained, partly through a shared agreement not to examine certain choices too closely, that habit had consequences. Spenlow had not pulled Thiessen from the team. That decision had come from somewhere above him, and he had passed it down without friction, which was its own kind of decision. Quinlan inserted alone at 0340 on a Tuesday in February. She carried her own kit, 11.4 kilograms, including the weapons system, the spotting equipment, the thermal wrap, the emergency rations. She had supplemented from her own supplies. Because the kit she had been issued was 400 calories short of the operational minimum for a 16-hour window. She had noted the discrepancy. She had submitted the note. No one had responded. The north ridge of Marker 7 is not a hospitable place in February. The rock shelves at angles that make stable prone positions difficult to establish, and the wind comes off the lake to the northwest in irregular patterns that require constant adjustment. A two-person team manages this by sharing observation duties, by maintaining each other's core temperature awareness, by providing the kind of mutual monitoring that turns a difficult environment into something merely demanding. A solo operator manages it by not making mistakes. Quinlan made no mistakes. She reached her position at 0510, established her sight picture, logged her environmental readings, and began her wait. The extraction window opened at 1200. The asset and their family were to move along a specific vehicle route that Quinlan's position would cover. If the route had been compromised, if someone was waiting where they should not be, her job was to see them before they saw the asset, and to act accordingly. At 0823, she saw something that was not in the operational brief. There were two vehicles parked at the secondary junction, 1,340 meters from her position. This was a distance at which most trained snipers operate with a measurable degree of uncertainty. Wind drift, mirage, the small accumulated errors of range estimation that even excellent shooters carry into their calculations. At this distance, Quinlan's margin of error was, by her own subsequent documentation, approximately 4 centimeters. She had verified this on 3 separate range sessions with 2 different weapon systems and logged the results, as she logged everything, in a notebook that she kept in her left breast pocket. She observed the vehicles for 47 minutes. She identified 3 individuals, their positions, their patterns of movement, the timing of a rotation that occurred at roughly 20-minute intervals, and the presence of a 4th individual who remained inside one of the vehicles and did not exit during the observation period. She made her calculations. She noted the wind. She noted the temperature, which had dropped 4 degrees from her initial reading. She adjusted, and then she waited. Because the extraction window had not opened yet, and because she had not been authorized to act without contact from command, and because she had been trying to reach her command element on the encrypted channel since 0831 and was receiving nothing but static. This is the part of the story that matters most, and it is also the part that was most carefully managed in the aftermath. The communication failure was later attributed to equipment malfunction. The formal inquiry used that phrase, equipment malfunction, in a way that answered no questions and foreclosed several others. Quinlan had logged 7 contact attempts between 0831 and 1147. She had noted each attempt, the time, the channel, the signal quality. She had noted the absence of response. She had done everything a solo operator can do when the link between herself and her command element dissolves into silence, which is to say she had continued to do her job. The asset's vehicle appeared at 11:54. What happened in the next 11 minutes was the subject of a review process that lasted, in various forms, for the better part of 2 years. The formal version, the one that was filed and archived and eventually summarized in a document that described itself as conclusive, said that Specialist Quinlan had acted outside the scope of her authorization. It noted that she had discharged her weapon 3 times. It noted that the extraction was successful. It noted that all 3 individuals who had been positioned to intercept the asset were no longer in a position to do so. And then it said, in the careful passive voice that bureaucratic language reserves for things it does not want to examine too directly, that questions had been raised regarding the appropriateness of the engagement. The document did not note that Quinlan had saved 4 lives. It did not note that the communication failure had left her without guidance during an active threat. It did not note that her 3 shots had been fired at distances of 1,340, 1,287, and 1,301 meters under deteriorating conditions, and that each had been placed within 6 centimeters of its intended point of impact. It did not note any of this, because the document was not about what had happened. It was about what could be made of what had happened. What was made of it was a designation. Quinlan was reclassified. not discharged, that would have required a hearing. And a hearing would have required witnesses. And witnesses would have said things that contradicted the document. She was reclassified into a category that the Canadian Armed Forces maintains for individuals whose continued presence in operational roles is assessed as not in the interests of operational coherence, which is a phrase that means she knows something and we cannot have her in a room where other people might ask what it is. She was reassigned to a training role at a facility on Trenton. Administrative function. No field access, no operational briefings. She was told that the reassignment was temporary, which is the word the institution uses when it means permanent, but has not yet decided whether to say so. She accepted the reassignment in writing. She also, in the same week, requested access to the full CASPAR operational file, including communications logs, the original team composition authorization, and the documentation for Corporal Thiessen's removal. The request was denied on the grounds of operational security. She submitted an appeal. The appeal was denied. She submitted a formal grievance under the Canadian Forces Grievance Authority. The grievance process, she was informed, could take up to 24 months. She waited. She was, as previously noted, exceptionally patient. This is where the story becomes something different from what it appeared to be. Because, while Vera Quinlan waited, she was not idle. She had her mother's mathematical mind and her father's understanding of what it means to work in the dark, and she applied both to what she had. She reviewed every document she had been given. She cross-referenced the communication logs. She had kept herself against the maintenance records for the equipment she had been assigned, which she had obtained through a separate administrative request that no one had thought to flag as significant. She noted that the equipment assigned to her for CASPAR had been logged as fully functional 48 hours before insertion. She noted the technician's name on the maintenance record. She noted that the same technician had signed off on a different set of equipment the following day. Equipment that had gone to a different team in a different region on a different operation. She began to draw a map, not a literal map. She had enough of those. But the kind of map you build when you are trying to understand a terrain that does not show on any satellite image. The terrain of decisions. Who made them? When? What the making of each decision required the person before them to have done first. She was precise about this. She was patient about this. And slowly, the way cold reveals structure, that warmth conceals, the shape of it began to appear. The communication failure was not equipment malfunction. She could not prove this the way a court proves things, but she could demonstrate to herself, to the careful mathematical part of herself that had been trained to account for variables and was allergic to explanations that required too many coincidences, that the probability of a genuine equipment failure producing exactly this pattern of non-response at exactly this window on exactly this operation was low enough to be functionally impossible. She wrote this up, she attached her supporting documentation, she put it in a file, and then she waited for the right place to put the file. It arrived as the moments that change things tend to arrive, not with announcement but with a phone call, a private number, Ontario area code, a voice she did not recognize. The voice belonged to a woman named Judith Carrière. A name Quinlan will tell you meant nothing to her at the time, though it would mean a great deal very shortly after. Carrière was a senior policy advisor with a department whose name is deliberately unremarkable, and she had been monitoring the CASPAR grievance filing with the particular attention of someone who had seen a shape like this before. Not this exact shape, but a shape with the same underlying geometry. She asked Quinlan to come to Ottawa. They met in a coffee shop on Elgin Street on a Thursday morning in late October, the kind of gray Ottawan autumn day where the sky and the pavement are nearly the same color and people move with their heads slightly down. Carrière was 53, precise in the way of someone who had learned to use precision as a form of protection, and she arrived 8 minutes early, which Quinlan also noted and found reassuring. Carrière did not tell her everything. She told her enough. She told her that the CASPAR operational file contained a discrepancy in the original team composition authorization that could not be explained by standard reassignment procedures. She told her that Corporal Thiessen had never received a formal reassignment order. She told her that the order that pulled him from the team had been generated from a command node that should not have had access to Caspar personnel allocations. And she told her that this was the third time in 4 years that a communication failure had been attributed to equipment malfunction in an operation involving a specific oversight body. She did not name the oversight body. She told Quinlan that she would understand in time why the naming had to happen in a particular sequence. Quinlan asked what she needed. What Carrière needed was the notebook, the small, water-resistant notebook that Quinlan kept in her left breast pocket on every operational deployment, in which she logged contact attempts and environmental readings and all the other granular, timestamp details that make a human record of an event irreplaceable because it exists in a form that cannot be retroactively accessed and edited by the people who control the digital systems. The notebook was, in the language of evidence, a contemporaneous record, and it contains 7 contact attempts, logged by time, by channel, by signal quality, in the handwriting of the person who had made them. Quinlan had kept the notebook. Of course she had kept the notebook. She had kept every notebook from every deployment since her first, stored in a fireproof box in the apartment in Trenton that she rented month to month because she had never quite believed in her own permanence anywhere. 41 notebooks in total. She knew this without counting. She told Carrière she would need to make copies. Carrière told her that copies were fine. What she needed was the original, because originals have properties that copies do not. Ink pressure, paper compression, the microscopic characteristics that allow a forensic document examiner to establish with the kind of certainty that closes certain kinds of arguments that a record was made when its maker says it was made. Quinlan asked how long the process would take. Carrière said she did not know. She said it with the honesty of someone who has been doing this long enough to understand that timelines in this kind of work are not something you promise, because the things that determine them are not all visible from where you are standing. It took 14 months. During those 14 months, Quinlan continued to work her administrative role at Trenton. She continued to submit her timesheets on time and her equipment reports accurately and her range qualification scores, which remained what they had always been, which is to say, anomalously high for someone who was classified as administrative. She did not discuss her meeting with Carrière. She did not discuss the notebook. She answered the questions she was asked and did not ask the questions she was not yet supposed to ask, and she waited, because waiting with purpose is not the same as waiting with resignation. And she understood the difference in her bones. In the 14th month, the oversight review, initiated by Carrière's department, produced a preliminary finding. The finding ran to 68 pages. It documented the discrepancy in Corporal Thiessen's reassignment order. It documented the communication node irregularity. It documented 2 previous operations in which similar patterns had appeared, though in those cases, no individual had maintained sufficiently detailed contemporaneous records to allow the pattern to be established with the precision the finding required. It documented the gap between the equipment maintenance logs and the reported failure mode. And it documented, in a section that ran to 11 pages and was written in the careful, non-inflammatory language of institutional review, because inflammatory language gives people something to argue about instead of something to answer. The sequence of decisions that had placed a solo operator in an 18-hour field deployment without functioning communications, in the knowledge that this was what they were doing. The finding did not use the word deliberate. It used the phrase not consistent with established risk management protocols in ways that cannot be attributed to oversight or procedural failure. That phrase, in the language of institutional review, means deliberate. The individual whose command node had generated the unauthorized reassignment order was a brigadier general named Whitmore, who had retired 14 months prior, 1 week after Quinlan submitted her formal grievance, and was living in Victoria. He issued a statement through a lawyer. The statement contained the word unfortunate 4 times and the phrase regrettable procedural anomaly twice. It contained no apology and no acknowledgement of any specific action. Carrière called Quinlan on the morning the finding was released. She called before the media release because she had told Quinlan she would, and she was the kind of person who does what she says she will do. She told Quinlan the finding was out. She told her what it contained. And then she said something that Quinlan has described in the single interview she gave on the subject as the thing she did not know she had been waiting to hear. Carriere said, "Your logs are in the finding, cited by name. The record you kept is the record that made this possible." Quinlan was quiet for a moment. Outside her window in Trenton, the St. Lawrence was doing what it does in December, which is move with the particular indifference of something that has been moving for a very long time and does not require anyone's permission to continue. She said, "I know," not because she was certain of the outcome. She had never been certain of the outcome, but because she had known, since February, since the Ridge, since the cold rifle, and the 7 unanswered contact attempts, that the record she kept was the only thing that would be there when the noise cleared, that what you document is what survives, that precision applied with patience does not guarantee justice. Nothing guarantees justice, but it creates the conditions under which justice becomes possible. She was reinstated to operational status 4 months later, not to Caspar, which no longer existed, to a new role in a different unit with a scope of responsibilities that was described in her file as expanded. She was promoted. The promotion came without ceremony, which was how she preferred it. She has not given another interview since the first one. She has not spoken publicly about Caspar, or the finding, or the 14 months, or the coffee shop on Elgin Street. She continues to maintain her range qualification, which continues to be what it has always been. She continues to keep her notebooks in a new fireproof box in a new city, and she continues to log what she logs. Time, channel, signal quality, wind, temperature, the small verifiable facts of the world as she finds it. The last page of the notebook she carried on Caspar is still blank. She has not filled it in and does not plan to. Some records are complete precisely because they know where to stop.